From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kayleigh Lines, I'm Joe Matthew. Debt ceiling negotiations now officially underway in Washington, but few signs that President Biden is any closer to a deal with Republican lawmakers.
I made it clear, America is not a deadbeat nation. We pay our bills. And folks, Republicans in Congress used to understand this.
Plus, Republican Representative George Santos released on bail after getting arrested for fraud and money laundering. The congressman pleading not guilty to all charges and using some familiar language.
The reality is it's a witch hunt, because it makes no sense that in 4 months, 5 months, I'm indicted.
And we'll talk about the fallout from the sexual assault ruling against former President Donald Trump, what it means for the Republican Party, and the outlook for 2024. All that coming up this hour on Balance of Power. Kayleigh, it's great to see you at the table today. Good thing it's another slow news day, so we don't have that much to talk about.
Well, slow certainly when it comes to progress on the debt ceiling, because, of course,
true.
At this hour yesterday, Joe, all eyes were on the White House and the meeting between President Biden and congressional leadership, in which it didn't really feel like anything tangible came out of it. The question now is whether any tangible progress is going to come, as their staff is now talking and they're gearing up for another meeting on Friday.
You were up there on Capitol Hill. You'll share some of your conversations with lawmakers from earlier today. But then, of course, another lawmaker is in the news here with George Santos. Remarkable, a $500,000 bond gets him out today, but he's been indicted.
Yeah, he says, though, he is not guilty and he doesn't plan on resigning. So we will be talking about that. But as you said, Joe, I spent a lot of the day on Capitol Hill today asking lawmakers about the debt ceiling. And frankly, it seemed like everyone was pretty much just sticking with the party line.
We should stop playing these partisan games that people are playing and get this done.
Default on our debt is not an option.
I think now it's just back to the drawing board.
The Republican proposition is a non-starter.
The Senate needs to try to pass something, and then we can sit down and figure out the finer points of what both chambers can agree to.
The White House can't continue to stonewall. This is too critical. The House has passed a measure to raise the debt limit. The White House either has to accept that or negotiate for something they prefer.
I really feel like it's disingenuous that the president is not wanting to negotiate at all.
I think it makes sense to try to get progress made on the budget for FY24, but don't use paying our bills as hostage.
Of all of the debt ceiling crises I've been through, this one worries me the most.
Okay. So let's talk about this further. Joining us around the table today are Bloomberg's Megan Scully and Jack Fitzpatrick, joining us from Bloomberg Government. So, Jack, just to start with you, doesn't really sound like anyone is straying from the script here, but I have to wonder if that's true behind the scenes, away from the cameras as well. What are you hearing about whether or not any real progress is happening in the background?
It's early to tell if there's progress happening in the background. I think maybe the bad news is nobody seems to agree fully on whether those staff-level conversations are actually about the debt limit. The Republicans came out and said we're going to have staff-level conversations. We're going to meet again Friday on the debt limit. Democrats, including Senator Schumer, said, well, we're going to talk about the budget process and appropriations bills, but we're not going to let the Republicans tie those two together. If they could find common ground on spending priorities, is it really that hard for Democrats to fold that into a debt limit vote? Right now, they say yes. I asked Senator Brian Schatz, who's one of the appropriators who writes those bills, are you going to find common ground on spending caps? To be honest, he laughed at some of the reporters who even asked. They are very determined that they're not going to tie them together, but at least they are talking about spending cuts or wherever they can find common ground.
This is quite a bit of showbiz here. First of all, it would be easier, I think, to say who Kayleigh did not talk to today on Capitol Hill. So great job assembling all of these voices. I guess the question I have is, should we believe any of them? Because there's a party line here that appears to be on both sides galvanizing with time. Even as we actually find some cracks, there's some reason for optimism as we walk up to a meeting on Friday. Do you see it that way?
Yeah, I think that, at this stage of the game, we're still a couple weeks out, which in Congress time is nowhere near a deadline. They're worse on deadlines than journalists are. So, they have time to strike a deal. But whether they can strike a deal on spending, which is what, Republicans would want, is that seems far-fetched to me given the time constraints. You have to go sort of program by program. And when we saw this play out a dozen years ago, the spending and the debt limit were linked, and it took a long time to hatch a deal. The progress that we saw on Friday was agreeing to continue talking, which I think was, or not on Friday, yesterday, and to meet again on Friday. I think that was probably the best progress we could hope for, and now staff are trying to work behind the scenes to figure out where their bosses might be able to forge some kind of compromise.
Well, the boss at the White House, Joe, is also not just sitting around while the staff talk. He's taking his message upstate in New York, speaking from Hudson earlier today about this. Take a listen.
Here's what's happened if MAGA Republicans get their way. American defaults on our debt, higher interest rates for credit cards, car loans, mortgages, payments for Social Security, Medicare, our troops, veterans could all be halted or delayed. Our economy would fall into recession, and our international reputation would be damaged in the extreme.
And I guess I should have said Valhalla, but in the Hudson Valley. You take a girl out of New York after 3 months and she forgets geography. But Megan, on this point where he's talking about how it would be a problem not just for the U.S., but for the world, it is a question of where the blame falls, on whose shoulders. Republicans and Democrats both still seem pretty convinced at this point that it will be the other party that takes the blame, which maybe is why neither is willing to blink.
Well, traditionally, the president is who usually gets the blame when the economy does nosedive. In this instance, though, because we're watching politics, like the messy progress of policymaking play out in real time, I think that they both are going to share the blame here. Kevin McCarthy doesn't want a default, but Kevin McCarthy also doesn't want to lose his speakership. So he's going to have to decide how much of a leash he has to negotiate with the president and with congressional Democrats to forge some kind of deal that doesn't put him, against conservatives in his party.
I want to come back to the idea of a short-term solution here, Jack, because both sides said before the meeting yesterday they were not interested in that. McCarthy says we're not extending the debt ceiling or suspending it till September 30, and the White House says we're not making a plan for that either. But the president did allow for that opportunity when he was talking with reporters following the meeting. He also acknowledged the 14th Amendment, as a matter of fact. But with regard to a short-term solution, Bloomberg Intelligence is writing today that that is the most likely outcome at this point. Do you see it that way?
It is very hard to tell. You don't have people spelling out their reliance on emergency measures, a short-term stopgap or the 14th Amendment argument or that, anything like that, until it's actually necessary. We still don't really know when the deadline is. It could be as early as early June. It could be as late as early August. As the time frame narrows and the experts watch the pace of spending and revenue, it's possible that they will very suddenly realize that the debt limit deadline is upon them, and people who didn't want a short-term extension might be forced to rely on one. It's a very unpredictable situation, especially because that so-called X date, there's about a 2-month range of where it could be, and they are having a lot of trouble narrowing that down.
Speaking of unpredictable situations, Joe, it seems like none of us could ever anticipate or predict what the next headline was going to be that crossed regarding Congressman George Santos. But we know today he was indicted on 13 counts by the Justice Department, pleaded not guilty to all of those, said he's going to fight the fight and isn't going to resign. It does raise, though, a question for House Speaker Kevin McCarthy. This was something that was raised by Democratic Congressman Jerry Connolly of Virginia when I spoke with him earlier.
It is an enormous stain on the institution and, frankly, on Kevin McCarthy's leadership that he kept him as long as he did because he needed his vote to be Speaker.
Megan, how does the House Speaker handle this? What is he likely to do while the justice system works its way through this?
Well, it's not unusual for a sitting House member or senator, for that matter, to be indicted and to continue in office. And McCarthy needs every vote he can get. Remember, he got his budget deal through. He squeaked it through with just 2 additional votes, 217 to 215. He loses Santos and he loses a vote. And that's how he sees it right now. McCarthy has said that he would request Santos resign, not demand he resign, if he were convicted. So that's a long time from now and could push us until well past the election. You know, there was a member, Jim Trafficant, some of you may recall, from Ohio, known for his flamboyant sense of style and his flair on the floor. And he was expelled. He was the last member who was actually expelled, but that didn't actually happen until 3 months after he was convicted.
So all that said here, I heard a lot of talk about we're going to let the legal process work its way out. Republican leaders in the House held a news conference earlier today. Jack, we heard from Elise Stefanik, Steve Scalise. Let the legal process run its course. He already stepped down from his committee. That's all we're going to see, right? It's going to be the voters that have to fire him if anyone does.
I mean, if he gets convicted, you see how many members want to vote to expel him. Yeah. McCarthy has said that if he's convicted, he would ask him to resign. That is different than voting to expel him. Until that happens, you know, George Santos has made it clear how important his vote is, as we saw in that debt limit vote where he waited until the very end to cast the last vote. They're not in much of a position to take the high road and have leadership kick him out before it's absolutely necessary. So they've given him a pretty long leash.
So get used to seeing George Santos around for a while, it looks like. Jack, thank you. Bloomberg's Jack Fitzpatrick, along with Bloomberg's Megan Scully, with us around the table today. Coming up, we'll get the Democratic take on the debt debate ahead with New York Congressman Gregory Meeks. That's next on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. It is Wednesday, May 10th, which Joe just puts us weeks away from the potential X date of June 1st, which Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has suggested is potentially that early that the U.S. will not be able to meet its obligations. And yet we continue to sit here and talk about how both sides of the aisle are just further digging in their heels, not necessarily getting us closer to any kind of agreement.
That's largely true. You spoke with lawmakers this morning on Capitol Hill, as you brought to us earlier, making it pretty clear that the party lines here are not shifting. Everything, though, remains on the table, including the 14th Amendment, according to the president yesterday, maybe a short-term solution, suspending the debt limit. But also default is technically still on the table, as the president told us yesterday following that meeting with Speaker McCarthy and the other leaders.
Right. You heard Chuck Schumer saying they explicitly asked Speaker McCarthy to take default off the table, and he refused to do so. So let's add another voice to this conversation now. Joining us now is Democratic Congressman Gregory Meeks of New York, joining us from Capitol Hill. Congressman, thank you so much for your time. As we've been discussing, it doesn't seem like there has been much movement on the Democratic side of the aisle toward an agreement, a compromise with Republicans. We're just weeks away, potentially, from a default on the U.S. debt, questioning the full faith and credit of the United States. When is it time to switch strategy?
Well, let me first thank you for having me on. And I think that, you've got to look at my Republican colleagues and Speaker McCarthy, who is basically trying to hold America's debt hostage. I mean, that's all that you could call, because the president back in March, on March 9th, had said, if you want to talk about the budget and budget cuts, put up your budget. He's already put up his on March 9th. Let's discuss where we need to look at and where we can agree to have cuts, where we need to move in that regards. The Republicans, McCarthy, did not do that. He's come up with a budget that passed by just the vote of Congressman Santos. That was the difference in the margin of passing it and not passing it. And so now, what I think that should happen and will happen is time for some of the more responsible Republicans to stand up, as well as a hearing from Senator McConnell. As you indicated in your last segment, just about everybody walked out of the meeting with the White House saying that we're going to make sure that we will not default on our debt. Leader Jeffrey said it, Chuck Schumer said it, as well as McConnell said it. The only one that did not say it was McCarthy. So he's got his thumb on the switch. He's got to decide that he agrees with the other three legislative leaders that we will make sure that the debt will not be in default.
Well, Congressman, the president went to your home state today, President Biden in New York earlier to deliver his message on the debt ceiling. Let's listen.
If we default on our debt, the whole world is in trouble. This is a manufactured crisis. There's no question about America's ability to pay its bills. America has the strongest economy in the world, and we should be cutting spending and lowering the deficit without a needless crisis, in a responsible way.
If we default, the whole world is in trouble, Congressman. That is quite a message. I realize that you think the ball is in Kevin McCarthy's court, that he needs to step down from his demands and pass a clean debt ceiling bill. But as we approach the X date, if the whole world is in the crosshairs here, at some point, doesn't everyone start looking ridiculous?
Well, I think that McCarthy does look ridiculous. He looks ridiculous now by holding this hostage. I think every other adult, as I've indicated, whether it's McConnell, Schumer, or Jeffries, and this president, we agree. We cannot allow even the threat of defaulting on our debt to happen. It makes us look bad around the world. The former chair and now the ranking member on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and yes, they're looking at us scratching their head. I was last night. It was Europe Day. I was with the 27 European ambassadors. All the number one question is, what's going to happen? So the world is looking at what we're doing. We're supposed to be the strongest, the greatest, and the biggest economic country in the world, and to be playing around with our debt does not look good. And that's why I think that it is important to hear from Senator McConnell also. And I think that there's a little crumb that he left on the table for Speaker McCarthy to look at. And I think that's got to be the way. And hopefully in the next week or so that we take this debt default off the table and we work together doing our jobs to work on the budget. Look, the debt that we're talking about, 25% of it was created by Donald Trump. Let's pay it. I mean, it's just that simple. Let's pay the debt that we owe. Let's make sure that we work together to look at the spending. But what they put on the table last week, they know it's DOA and it's also debt on America. So it's time to get past the hostage taking and let's get this deal done.
Congressman, to switch topics here, because there was a lot of news in Washington today, including another representative from the state of New York, Congressman George Santos, being indicted on 13 counts, to which he has pleaded not guilty to all of them. But I spoke with another New York colleague of yours, Democratic Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, about that. This is what she said.
It's always, frankly, very sad when a public official that is responsible for properly stewarding the public trust betrays that trust. It is absolutely imperative that George Santos resign from his seat. It is extremely important for the integrity of this body.
But Congressman George Santos has indicated he will not be resigning. So what would your message be to House leadership today?
My message is to my Republican colleagues. They should be putting the pressure on George Santos because he's a stain on their house. He is a guy who everyone knows is a fraud. In fact, he's admitted that he's a fraud. And now we can show that that fraud has also led to a criminal indictment. So, I know that there's some members of Congress, particularly on the Republican side. I've seen them on television and talking about how bad Santos is and that they think he shouldn't be here. Well, they can do something about it. If the Republicans within the House, since Santos is within their midst, if they stood up and told McCarthy it is time for this guy to go because he's hurting us, then I think that forces
McCarthy. If they do not, though, it's up to the voters, right, Congressman? The voters have the final word on whether he gets fired.
Well, that's true. If it gets up to voters or if he gets imprisoned, indicted, and sent to jail, then that speaks for itself also before the election. But clearly this guy's a fraud, and the voters ultimately will have the say if, in fact, he can last without going to jail for that long.
Many thanks for being with us, Congressman. It's good to see you again. New York Congressman Gregory Meeks with us here on Balance of Power. You can't vote from jail, can you? I don't think that works very well.
Yeah.
The monthly CPI report showing continued signs of a slowdown in U.S. inflation. We're going to tackle that next and get the latest with Bloomberg's chief economist, Tom Orlik. That's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. Thanks for joining us. U.S. inflation showing some signs of cooling off with new data out this morning. For more, we bring in Bloomberg chief economist Tom Orlik. Tom, it's great to see you. Is the Fed all done here? Is the work done or what?
You know, it's interesting, Joe. I think the markets very much want to believe that. Mm-hmm. We saw a big drop in yields when the CPI data was released this morning. Our view, though, is actually the evidence from the April CPI numbers is a bit more mixed. Yes, we saw some deflation in services, and that's crucial for getting the Fed back to their 2% target. But we also saw some reflation in the goods sector, particularly in used cars. Put the pieces together, and actually, we think inflation is going to stay stubbornly high. We see the CPI ending the year still around 4%. That's way too high for the Fed to begin cutting, and it means market bets on cuts we think are going to be frustrated.
Well, speaking of market bets, we've started to see some angst around the debt ceiling showing up at T-bills as well, U.S. credit default swaps too. How are you gaming out the different scenarios from a potential default to potentially another downgrade like we saw in 2011?
So that is the question of the hour, Kaylee. For me, the best summary of how debt ceiling negotiations play out in Washington came from Bloomberg's own Stephen Dennis, one of our veteran Senate reporters. And he summarized it like this. Debt ceiling negotiations go no, 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 yes to a provisional increase, no, 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 yes. So where are we right now? We're still in one of those provisional no's.
We sure are.
Why haven't we seen a bigger market reaction beyond those Treasury bills and CDS things you flagged, Kaylee? I think it's because the markets have seen this film before. They've seen this script before, right? And so even though they hear the fierceness of the partisan divide right now, there's still an expectation that at the end of all of those no's, there's still going to be a yes.
Boy.
Well,
did you count how many no's that was? Because I need to use this model as we go forward.
It was a lot of no's, and I want to know how many no's we're into it at this point and how many no's will we still get by Friday. Tom, we got to leave it there, but thank you so very much.
Close,
That's
Tom.
our Tom Orlik of Bloomberg Economics. Now, coming up, we're going to stay on the topic of the debt limit and speak with Maya MacGuineas. She is president of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. We'll get her thoughts on the spending cuts that should be on the table and where we go from here. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. I'm Kaylee Lyons alongside Joe Matthew. Anne-Marie Hordern is on assignment. And Joe, we're sitting here in Washington where we are looking for some kind of progress on the debt ceiling talks. And in theory, the staff from congressional leadership and the White House are talking about this. Yes. There is a question, though, as to whether or not they actually know what they're talking about, because one side thinks they're negotiating on the budget. The other side thinks they're talking about the debt ceiling, it seems.
That's right. It's kind of like a bad joke, like how many staffers it takes to screw in a light bulb or something. I don't know what it would be. But they're also trying to represent their bosses without exactly knowing their positions because things are so vague still on both sides.
Yeah, it's a really good point. What we do know, though, ultimately, is that what Republicans want is to address the deficit, which is why they would like to see spending cuts. So let's have that conversation now. Yesterday, the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget released a statement following those debt limit talks between Biden and congressional leadership, saying, quote, the only thing negotiators should take off the table is default. Joining us now is Maya MacGuineas. She is president of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. Maya, great to see you. Thank you so much for being here. So if a default should be off the table, it's really a question of what is on the table. We know that Republicans want to address the deficit. They would like to see spending cuts. What they are targeting, though, is discretionary spending because no one wants to touch things like Social Security and Medicare. So even if they were to get what they wanted, how effective would it really be at addressing that problem?
Right. Great question. Let me just start by saying, because I so often am worried about where we are fiscally, I actually have a good feeling, and I'm knocking on wood, but after those meetings yesterday, I came out of watching them thinking, okay, they all understand this deal has to get done. And they also understand that there are going to be savings that are attached to it. And Democrats will say it was part of the budget process. Republicans will say it was part of the debt ceiling increase. They can both describe it the way they want to. But I have a feeling that there is certainly a deal to be had. Now, your point is an excellent one, which is the real drivers of the fiscal challenges we have. Social Security, and Medicare, both of which are going to be facing insolvency in just over a year. But retirement and health care programs and the lack of revenues are the big issues that we actually need to put on the table. So here's an idea that I think could make all of this workable. They have to compromise on what the House Republicans have put forward and what the president's budget was, and there are a lot of compromises to be had there. But I think they should also add in a fiscal commission, which is something that would take some of the politics away from all of this, but they have to acknowledge what the president has been very happy to pretend isn't the case, as was President Trump. But we have to make changes to Social Security and Medicare. Otherwise, those programs are going to face major across-the-board cuts for recipients and providers. And we're going to have to put more revenue into the budgetary system to help close that gap. So a fiscal commission could help do all of that. And on the other side, the thing that they're going to be talking about in the rooms for the next days and weeks, I do believe there's a compromise to be had on how much discretionary growth there is over the next decade and some of the other savings that have been suggested.
Well, so here we are, Maya, fighting over what should be a whole pie, and we're really fighting over a piece of that pie, and it's confusing the conversation to the point where the speaker yesterday said that President Biden was lying about cuts to veterans' care programs, for instance, because the president says if you don't include the entire budget, to your point, you're going to have draconian cuts in smaller slices of the budget. It brings me to this column in the New York Times from Paul Krugman, who I know loves to mention you on a fairly regular basis, suggesting that he's calling you out for the group, for the CRFB, referring to the House passing a reasonable bill to reduce the deficit. With everything we've just said, what's reasonable about that?
Well, first I will say what's not reasonable is the fact that Paul Krugman, much like other people in our political arena, uses a platform to be a bully and call names. And he's been doing it for years. And it seems to me, such a poor use of really important space when we should be talking about policies. Paul Krugman aside, the reason I thought what the House Republicans put forth was reasonable was because there had been talk about putting forth a plan that would balance the budget over 10 years. That would not have been reasonable. It would have been $16 trillion in savings. We couldn't have gotten it done. It would have been just a talking point. They put forward a plan that was about $4.8 trillion in savings. The president has a plan that's about $3 trillion in savings. Neither is enough to really bring down our dangerous fiscal trajectory, but both would be very serious first steps. Now there's a way to compromise. And just for example, in discretionary spending, Republicans said we should spend $1.5 trillion. The president has said we should spend $1.7 trillion on this discretionary area. Between 1.5 and 1.7, there's a compromise to be had. But again, to the real point, we have to talk about the bigger things: Social Security, Medicare, revenues. I really hope they choose to include a big fiscal commission. They should also, while they're looking at these things, reform the debt ceiling. Because while the debt ceiling many times before has been used to help put through packages of savings, though under President Trump we actually included on the debt ceiling packages that made the debt worse. And that was something that both parties were kind of bought into. But we should reform the debt ceiling because we can't continue to have this drama. So if we can fix our fiscal situation and reform the debt ceiling as part of a commission alongside the package of savings that we'll probably have as part of this, that's going to go a long way to improving our fiscal situation. And I will just say one more thing about
reform. I'm sorry to interrupt, but when you say reform, are you meaning get rid of it, change it? What exactly is the suggestion?
Yeah, so what we need is we do need something that controls our borrowing. Right now, there's nothing in our budget process that requires, well, there's nothing that requires we even budget. You'll notice we haven't put forth budgets. Neither of the budget committees have put forth budgets yet. There's no budget in place. We need to have something that requires that we budget. Before we do other work, there should be a budget in place, but it also should limit the borrowing as part of that budget. So you should have to either have a debt ceiling or another mechanism that makes you take account of the borrowing when you're actually looking at legislation and determine whether you want to borrow for it or not after the fact. That completely breaks the link between the accountability of those, and I think that's where the problem is. And we shouldn't have something where a default is on the table, because that's just such a self-imposed chaos, and with our partisan politics the way it is these days, it's too dangerous for us to continue to have that as one of the mechanisms that's part of our budget process.
Maya, will staff members be the ones to work this out here? Do they do the heavy lifting, or will the principals sitting in a room like they will again on Friday hammer out these details?
You know, I think both of them are going to be huge parts of the solution. The staff do understand all the details of these policies, and they're looking at everything from how we're going to do discretionary spending to should we rescind some of the COVID spending to what should we do about the student debt forgiveness, which was very expensive and didn't go through Congress, whether work requirements should be a part of it, whether you could include as part of work requirements a study to figure out how to make them not so onerous. There's a lot of ideas that the staff are the real experts. And I think they'll make real progress. And of course, the principals are the ones who will have to make the ultimate decision and the ultimate deal. But I'm encouraged that these discussions are going on. We shouldn't have waited as long as we did. But everybody seems to be very engaged right now, and that's good news.
Nice to hear some optimism. Maya MacGuineas, thank you. The president of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget with us here on Balance of Power. Coming up, we're joined by our political panel to talk about the criminal charges now facing Congressman George Santos and a lot more. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV.
Now, keeping up to date with news from around the world, here's the first word. I'm John Hyland. Russia is trying to ease tensions with one of its neighbors. President Vladimir Putin has lifted a ban on flights to Georgia and eased visa requirements for its citizens. It's a major step to facilitate travel between neighbors whose relations have been icy since the 2008 war. In Pakistan, former Prime Minister Imran Khan will be in the custody of the country's graft agency for 8 days. That comes after his dramatic arrest on Tuesday, an event that triggered violent clashes across the country. It marked a sharp escalation in Khan's confrontation with the Prime Minister's government and Pakistan's powerful military. ECB officials are now thinking that interest rate hikes might need to continue in September to bring inflation fully under control. Bloomberg has learned there's no sense of confidence about an imminent pause. Still, the next ECB meeting is more than a month away and no decisions have yet been made. Much of Europe and the northeast U.S. are in store for sweltering temperatures this summer, well above historical norms. Scientists at the Copernicus Climate Change Service see a probability that temperatures will be sharply higher than average from June through August. Their data is used by farmers, insurers, and utilities to help minimize risk to crops and power grids. And Walt Disney reported a smaller than anticipated loss in its streaming business. In its earnings results today, the entertainment giant also posted second quarter sales and profit in line with Wall Street expectations. Total revenue for the company rose nearly $22 billion in the first quarter, driven by the strong performance of theme parks. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Originals. Powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm John Hyland, and this is Bloomberg.
He is a fraud and a liar. He should not be in Congress.
It is absolutely imperative that George Santos resign from his seat. It is extremely important for the integrity of this body.
Ultimately, that's going to be up to George, but pretty soon the writing's going to be on the wall of what he needs to do.
He's going to get his time in court, get to go through that. When that's resolved, then we see where we go.
It is an enormous stain on the institution and, frankly, on Kevin McCarthy's leadership that he kept him as long as he did, because he needed his vote to be Speaker.
I filed the expulsion resolution 3 months ago. It's quite frankly time for Speaker McCarthy to bring that expulsion resolution to the House floor so that people can cast their vote.
Those were just a few of the lawmakers I spoke to on Capitol Hill earlier today about the criminal charges facing Representative George Santos, who says he will not resign and has pleaded not guilty to all 13 counts. For more, let's bring in our political panel. Jim Kessler, Third Way Executive Vice President for Policy, is with us here in our D.C. studio, as is Chapin Fay, a Managing Director at Actum. So, Chapin, I'd like to go to you first because you actually worked with Congressman George Santos prior to the fact that he was a congressman. So tell us a little bit about that relationship and then how you react to this news today.
Sure. I was his first consultant in 2019 when he was putting his campaign together. We parted ways amicably. I was leaving the company that I was working with. He hadn't really gotten his campaign off the ground. We stayed in touch. I helped him during his recount process a little bit. Mm-hmm. He may not know that I walked off that job because of some of the things he was saying and doing. But that was the last, real substantial interaction I've had with him. My reaction, unfortunately, is a lot of us in New York, in particular in that area, knew this was going to come. This day was going to come. He treated politics and life the same way he has treated this paperwork, which was truth didn't matter. And unfortunately, the feds are a little less forgiving than voters. So I think he's in some real legal jeopardy.
So were you reacting to things that he was saying in the media, or was he dishonest with you as a colleague?
He was not dishonest to me. He became a little bit dishonest and aggressive in some of the things he was doing over the last cycle.
Aggressive?
Well, we stayed away from each other. I had, wasn't really involved with him, didn't care. It's politics. If I got upset, everyone had a mean word to say about me, I wouldn't be cut out for it. He got himself elected to Congress, and now we are here. But some of us were aware of some of the things that he was doing that was not great. And I advise some of my other candidates to campaign with him if you must. He's a candidate, but be careful around finances.
Wow.
Really interesting perspective to get. I would like to get your perspective as well, Jim, because Chapin was just talking about it's politics. The politics of this are very difficult in a House in which Speaker Kevin McCarthy has a very narrow majority. He needs his vote. Therefore, are we likely to really see leadership do anything about this?
They need to cut him off. They need to expel him. And
Need
Kevin
and will, though, is different.
Well, let me say this for some advice for Kevin McCarthy that he may or may not take. The Republicans in Congress, they have an ethics and principles problem. Like they stuck with Donald Trump's lies about the election and the January 6th insurrection and conspiracy theories. They need to do something that shows principle. And principle means doing something that's against your immediate self-interest. Kevin McCarthy should expel him before the sun goes down today, whether he needs that vote or not. They need to start to repair their own very damaged image and persona in America. And George Santos is the way to start doing that.
The Speaker did talk about it today. Here's Kevin McCarthy on the Hill earlier today.
No, with George Santos, I did not put him on any committees. In America, we'll just follow the same pattern we always have, right? If a person is indicted, they're not on committees, they have the right to vote, but they have to go to trial.
Chapin, is this as glib as it seems, that it simply comes down to math for Speaker McCarthy?
I think it would be extraordinary to expel a member of Congress simply because they were under investigation. And in fact, if we did that, I don't know the numbers offhand, we may not have a quorum in the House of Representatives. Yeah. This is America. You are innocent until proven guilty, including Representative George Santos, and he's going to have his day in court. He's pled not guilty.
What if he's convicted?
If he's convicted, absolutely. But the real point here is he cannot give up his seat because that's really his only leverage in this, in dealing with the prosecutors. I mean, if he goes all the way to trial, I think they've got him. If he negotiates some sort of deal, what else besides giving back some of the money does he have other than giving up his seat, which I think is his last lever of power for him. So I don't think he can give it up.
Well, you allude to the fact that the justice system needs to do its work here, and someone else working his way through the U.S. justice system is the former president, Donald Trump, who yesterday also was not found guilty of criminal charges, but in a civil case was found liable for sexual abuse and defamation. And this is the same man who currently looks to be the likely frontrunner for the Republican nomination in 2024. Do you foresee a point, Jim, where it becomes too much, even for Republicans, considering we also have the question marks over Georgia and the January 6th investigation and the documents?
Well, this is another decision that is more in the hands of Republicans and Republican leadership, I think, than even the voters here. So I think you could fill the Orange Bowl with the number of Republican elected officials and consultants who think that, like, it's time for Donald Trump to go. But the thing is, you can't go after Donald Trump with half measures. Like, it's a gunfight, so you need to bring a flamethrower. And you can't give these sort of namby-pamby, remarks here. Republican leadership, Republican elders, Republican donors, Republican elected officials need to say, like, this is too much. It's time for him to go. He will not get our support in any way, shape, or form, even if he gets the nomination.
You had to go with the Orange Bowl, Jim. Orange. Chapin, what's the move here for Ron DeSantis? Can he capitalize on this?
It's tough, right? Running against Donald Trump, I empathize with anyone, Democrat or Republican, running against Donald Trump because he and his supporters are epically good at fighting and getting into the mud. I think you've seen the governor fight back a little bit. I think you've seen President Trump come back. Ron DeSantis brings a knife, and like you said, Donald Trump was there with a flamethrower. I think he can capitalize. It's a counterintuitive thing. All of these. And I wouldn't call this being found liable a half measure, but all these little legal problems and issues, they all are going to add up at some point. It's like death by 1,000 cuts. But at the same time, something like being found liable with a jury in New York City is only emboldening Trump supporters in New York and the rest of the country. You know, there are a certain percentage of Republican voters who will never not vote for Donald Trump no matter what he does.
Yeah, sure.
So that's going to be difficult for any Republican primary contender. I mean, you can see it in some of the polling. No one's coming close, even the governor.
It's going to be an interesting ride with this town hall, Donald Trump on CNN later on tonight, isn't it?
Yeah, it's going to be a difficult one for them to navigate, I'm sure. I would also, to the point Chapin was just making, I spoke with Representative Byron Donalds of Florida today. He said this isn't about the Republican Party, this Trump case. It's about the Manhattan justice system,
Yeah,
which...
We've heard that line before, haven't we? Coming up, we'll be right back with our political panel to discuss House Republicans' ambitious border security proposal and the lifting of Title 42. This is Balance of Power, Bloomberg TV.
Thursday, tomorrow, May 11th at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time, the Title 42 public health order will terminate. At that point, we will once again process people at our southern border using our immigration enforcement authorities under Title 8 of the United States Code.
Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas speaking at a news conference a bit earlier today about the expiration of Title 42 border restrictions. Back with us now, our political panel, Jim Kessler, Third Way Executive Vice President for Policy, and Chapin Fay, Managing Director at Actum. It's great to have both of you with us here. Not only, Jim, is Title 42 being lifted at the border, and even the president yesterday said that we should be ready for some chaos. Alejandro Mayorkas says we've been planning for this for a year and a half. All the while, Republicans in the House are preparing their answer in a legislative vote. H.R. 2 will happen right around the time these restrictions are lifted. We've been spending a good deal of time talking about how we can't come to terms on a debt ceiling. We're never going to come to terms on immigration reform in this divided government either, are we?
It's really hard. And, you know, look, there were 4 real efforts, 2006, 2013, 2018, 2022. Frankly, Republicans backed out of each one of them. And, you know, it's in some ways chaos at the border works better for Republicans politically than solving the problem.
They say the same thing about Democrats.
Well, certainly, and Democrats definitely have their demands. They want past the citizenships and that sort of thing. But look, Biden is tougher on the border than most elected Democrats in Congress. And, you know, frankly, a lot of Democrats in Congress are uncomfortable with how harsh he is down there. That said, I think the pictures aren't going to look great for Biden in the next couple weeks.
And yet the White House also has been using the idea of border funding being cut as one of their talking points to push back against the bill McCarthy passed to raise the debt ceiling. Who ultimately wins that messaging war, Chapin?
I think, well, I have news for you. The chaos is already here. I mean, look at the news coming out of New York. You have a Democrat mayor who's certainly no conservative Republican complaining that the city is under siege, in chaos, running out of money. There's now, you know, as the president...
Greg Abbott keeps busing them there.
Well, that's also true. But they have to go somewhere. They have to be somewhere if we're not going to return them at the border or send them through the proper channel process. But President Biden is about to be in the Hudson Valley because that's ground zero for, you know, control of the House. And he's going to be just miles from where in Rockland County, a suburban area where they want to send all of the migrants that New York City, with a population of 8 million, can't handle. And so the county executive there declared a state of emergency. That's being litigated. I mean, this is a real problem, and it's now affecting the entire country. I would argue it has been for a while. But it's not just at the border where things are dangerous and out of control. It's now in New York City. It's about to be in the suburbs of New York City. It's going to be everywhere.
I'm sure all of us in the coming days are going to be glued from the images to the images.
Yeah, a lot of this will probably be hard to watch.
Yeah, I'm sure it will. Thank you both so much for joining us. Chapin Fay and Jim Kessler, our political panelists today. We appreciate your time. And Joe, that's going to wrap it up for us on Wednesday. I guess the question is, will Thursday bring any real progress on the conversation?
Progress, I don't know, but there will be a lot of news here. And you can read always a lot more about it in the Washington Edition newsletter, on the terminal, and online. Thank you for joining us on Balance of Power. That does it for us here in Washington, D.C. today. With Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew. We'll see you back here tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.